The laughter started while 11-year-old Lottie Rowan was carrying a tray of biscuits across the Sage Hollow schoolhouse. Before she reached the stove, millionaire cattleman Grant Hale heard one woman compare the child's patched brown dress to a feed sack and another ask whether her mother owned a mirror. Lottie stopped for half a second. Then, she kept walking. Her mother had taught her that carrying something hot required both hands and a steady step. The schoolhouse was crowded for the December social. Wet coats hung from pegs along one wall. Pine smoke curled near the rafters. Boots had tracked melting snow across the plank floor. Elsie Rowan stood behind a long table, cutting slices from an apple cake she had brought from home. She had heard the laughter too. Her knife stopped against the wooden board. Near the stove, Mrs. Ada Mercer leaned toward Mrs. Louise Treadwell. Both women wore new winter dresses beneath fur-trimmed cloaks. Ada looked toward Lottie again. The poor thing has 3 different browns on her. Louise gave a little laugh. 4, if you count the cuffs. Lottie reached the refreshment table. She set down the biscuits carefully. Elsie put the knife aside. "Lottie, would you bring another stack of plates from the kitchen?" "Yes, Mama." The girl turned before either woman could see her face clearly. Elsie watched her disappear through the side door. She did not confront Ada Mercer, not because she lacked words, because Ada's husband owned the largest feed store in Sage Hollow, and Louise's brother hired laundry work from half the widows in town. Elsie had learned that pride could become expensive when a woman had only $12 in a tin box and rent due after Christmas. She picked up the knife again. Across the room, Grant Hale had not moved. He stood beside the coat rack, holding a cup he had forgotten to drink from. At 40, Grant owned Hale Cross Ranch, nearly 15,000 acres of grazing country east of town. People called him rich because they could count his cattle. They called him a millionaire because they could not. Tonight he wore a plain black vest, a white shirt, and a heavy brown ranch coat that had been repaired beneath the right shoulder twice. The seam had split again that afternoon. A narrow tear showed whenever he lifted his arm. Grant looked toward Ada Mercer, then toward Elsie. Elsie was slicing cake as though nothing had happened. Only the way she pressed her thumb against the knife handle told him otherwise. Lottie returned with the plates. She had washed her face. That made Grant angrier than tears would have. The fiddler near the front wall began another tune. Conversation picked up again. Grant set down his cup. Then he walked across the room. Ada Mercer noticed him first. Her expression changed immediately. "Mr. Hale?" Grant nodded once. He passed her. He stopped beside Elsie's table. "Mrs. Rowan?" Elsie looked up. "Yes?" Grant removed his coat. He laid it across the table between the cake and a crock of apple butter. Several nearby conversations faded. Elsie stared at the garment. Grant pointed to the torn shoulder. "Can you tell me why this keeps splitting?" Elsie glanced toward him. "You came across the room during a social to ask me about a coat?" Yes, a few people were listening now. Grant did not lower his voice. Elsie wiped her hands on her apron. Then she lifted the coat. The wool was expensive, but the construction was ordinary. She turned the shoulder inside out. Whoever made this cut the back too narrow. Grant leaned closer. "It fits. Standing still." She pulled gently across the seam. The fabric tightened immediately. You ride in it, reach forward, lift things, work gates. This seam carries all of that. Grant raised one eyebrow. "Can it be fixed?" "Yes, for good?" "No," that drew a few quiet laughs from the men nearby. Grant almost smiled. Elsie laid the coat flat again. "It needs to be made differently." "How differently?" "I would have to watch how your men work." Grant nodded. "All right." Elsie frowned. "All right what?" "I need 80 winter coats." The fiddle stopped. This time, no one immediately resumed playing. Elsie stared at Grant. Ada Mercer's mouth opened slightly. Grant continued as if he were discussing fencing posts. My North crews leave after New Year. Store coat split at the shoulder, wear through inside the cuffs, and bind when a man reaches forward. You already have a supplier. I did. Calvin Reed, who stood near the back of the room, slowly lowered his coffee cup. He owned Reed Dry Goods. For 6 years, he had supplied nearly every ready-made winter garment used at Hale Cross. Grant looked only at Elsie. I want 80 coats made for work instead of shop windows. Elsie's fingers rested on the damaged seam. 80? 80? In less than a month? 26 days. A murmur moved through the schoolhouse. Elsie looked around the room. Now, everyone was watching. Lottie stood near the kitchen door, holding 3 clean plates against her chest. Ada Mercer no longer looked amused. Elsie turned back to Grant. If this is because of what happened 5 minutes ago, take your coat and sit down. Grant's face remained still. It isn't charity. It sounds expensive enough to become charity. It is a contract. Then, you should ask for a price before announcing it to half the county. That silenced the remaining whispers. Grant studied her for a moment. Then, he nodded. Fair enough. He picked up his coat. Elsie expected him to leave. Instead, he placed it back into her hands. Keep that overnight. Pull it apart if you need to. You may not get it back in one piece. I own others. I assumed so. Grant's mouth shifted at one corner. Bring me your price tomorrow. Elsie looked down at the coat. Mr. Hale, I work with 2 women when I have enough orders. 80 coats require cutters, finishers, space, cloth, buttons, lining, and wages before I see $1 of profit. Then include them in the price. And if my price is higher than Reed's, then I will decide whether your coat is worth more. Calvin Reed stepped forward. Hale, surely we can discuss whatever complaint you have with my goods privately. Grant finally looked at him. I am discussing new goods. Reed's face tightened. Elsie heard Lottie move closer. The girl stopped beside her mother. Grant glanced down at the brown dress. He did not compliment it. He did not mention the laughter. For that alone, Elsie thought better of him. Grant put on his hat. Tomorrow morning? Elsie looked at the torn coat again. Then at the people who had watched her daughter cross the room with her head lowered. She did not want Grant Hale's pity. She did not want his money unless she had earned every cent. But 80 coats could pay 6 months of rent. Done properly, it could become something larger than mending sleeves at a kitchen table. I will bring a bid, she said. Grant nodded. Then I will read it. He walked away. The fiddler raised his bow again. This time, Ada Mercer said nothing. Neither did Louise Treadwell. Lottie touched the worn cuff of her own dress. Mama? Elsie gathered Grant's heavy coat into her arms. Yes? Are you really making 80? Elsie looked toward the schoolhouse clock. 26 days. By tomorrow, she would need costs for wool, lining, buttons, labor, workspace, and delivery. She would need women willing to work. She would need a pattern that did not yet exist. And she would have to name a price without lowering it, simply because Grant Hale had defended her daughter without saying he had. Elsie picked up her cake knife. Not yet. That night, after Lottie was asleep, Elsie spread Grant's coat across her kitchen table. She opened her ruled notebook. On the first clean page, she wrote one line. 80 coats, 26 days. Then she sharpened her pencil and began counting everything that could go wrong. By 8 the next morning, Elsie Rowan had already crossed out 3 prices. The first would not cover wages. The second left nothing for mistakes. The third assumed she could buy heavy wool from Calvin Reed at the same wholesale rate he gave established ranch accounts. Elsie stared at that number longest. Then she closed her notebook. Martha Bell arrived carrying a sewing basket under one arm. "You look like you have been arguing with arithmetic." "I lost twice." Martha removed her gloves. At 46, she had worked for dressmakers, tailors, farm wives, and anyone else who paid in real money instead of promises. Elsie pushed Grant Hale's torn coat across the table. 80. Martha looked at her. 80 what? Coats. Martha sat down. Start again. Elsie explained the contract. She explained the deadline. She explained Grant's damaged shoulder seam. Martha listened without interruption. When Elsie finished, Martha picked up the coat and turned it inside out. 26 days? 25 now. You need more than 2 women. I know. You need space. I know. You need wool. I know. Martha looked at her over the coat. Good. I wanted to be certain you understood how foolish this is. By noon, Elsie had found 4 women willing to take piecework if she could guarantee payment every Saturday. She rented the empty room beside the rear entrance of Miller's Bakery for 2 weeks. The ceiling was low. The floor leaned toward one wall. But there was room for 2 treadle machines, 3 cutting boards laid across barrels, and a stove small enough to keep fingers working. Grant arrived shortly after 3. Elsie handed him 2 pages. My price. He read the total. Then he read it again. You are higher than Reed. I expected to be. By nearly 12%. Then, buy from Reed. Grant looked up. Elsie did not move. Behind her, Martha continued threading a machine as if a millionaire rancher standing 6 feet away were no reason to stop working. Grant tapped the second page. You want 1/3 in advance for materials. Only materials. Labor is paid from completed batches, and inspection every 20 coats. Yes, my foreman could organize delivery and production. No. Grant paused. Elsie folded her arms. My workroom. My workers. He has managed larger crews. Then he should manage yours. For several seconds, Grant said nothing. His thumb moved over the worn brass button on his coat. Then, he put the pages back on the table. Agreed, Elsie blinked. Agreed to what? All of it. That was not the argument she had prepared for. Grant signed beneath her total. I want the first sample in 3 days. You will have it. He left without another suggestion. Martha waited until the door shut. I dislike men who make a woman prepare an excellent argument and then refuse to fight. Elsie picked up the signed pages. I can survive the disappointment. 3 days later, the first coat was finished. It looked better than Grant's old one. It was also wrong. Elsie knew it before he put it on. The shoulder sat neatly while he stood beside the barn. Grant lifted both arms. The cloth pulled tight across his back. Elsie frowned. Again, Grant reached forward as if taking reins. The seam strained. It will hold, he said. That is not the same as working. Grant looked toward the ranch yard. What do you need? To see your men do their jobs. For the next 2 hours, Elsie followed the morning crew. She watched men mount from frozen ground. She watched one lift a feed sack into a wagon. Another reached across a gate while twisting at the waist. A ranch hand named Tom Becker swung his arm forward to throw a rope, and the back of his coat climbed nearly 3 inches. Elsie stepped closer. Do that again. Tom looked at Grant. Grant shrugged. Tom repeated the movement. Elsie pinched the fabric behind his shoulder. There, the problem was not the seam. It was the pattern. Back in Grant's tack room, she spread the sample across a bench. Then, she picked up her shears. Grant watched. That coat is finished. No, it is sewn. You are cutting apart a finished coat. Yes, we lost 3 days making it. We will lose 80 coats if I copy it. The shears closed through the new wool. Grant exhaled through his nose. Elsie cut a curved opening behind the shoulder and inserted a narrow wedge of cloth beneath it. A gusset? You know the word? I own shirts. She ignored that. By afternoon, the altered coat was ready. Tom Becker wore it during the second half of the day. He mounted, lifted, reached, worked a gait. Then he pulled a feed sack from the wagon and carried it across the yard. When he returned, Elsie inspected the shoulder. Nothing had shifted. Tom rolled both arms. Feels easier. Grant examined the seam himself. You changed the cuff too. The inside edge wears when a man works with rope or rough wood. Grant looked at her. How many store-bought coats have you made? None. How many ranch coats? 1. Tom raised a finger. Technically 2, if we count the one she murdered. Elsie looked at him. Tom lowered his hand. Grant almost laughed. Make 80 like this. 79. He nodded toward the repaired sample. 79. That evening, Elsie returned to Sage Hollow with the approved coat pattern folded beneath her arm. She went directly to Reed Dry Goods. Calvin Reed stood behind the counter adjusting a row of price cards. Elsie placed her material list before him. I need 160 yards of heavy wool, 40 of lining, thread, and 640 coat buttons. Reed read the list. Then, he named the price. Elsie thought she had misheard him. That is retail. Yes, you sold Martha wool at wholesale last month. Martha bought 12 yards. I am buying 10 times that. Reed straightened a bolt of navy cloth. My wholesale allocation is committed. To whom? My established accounts. Elsie studied him. Hale Cross was one of those accounts. It was. She understood. You lost Grant Hale's coat order, so now you intend to make mine impossible. Reed's expression remained mild. I intend to sell you anything in this store at the posted price. Elsie took back her list. She spent the rest of the afternoon visiting 2 other merchants. The first apologized. His winter wool came through Reed. The second had enough cloth for perhaps 6 coats, nothing more. When Elsie reached her workroom, Martha was waiting. 3 unfinished coats lay across the boards. Elsie opened her notebook. She calculated Reed's retail price. Then, labor. Then, lining. Buttons, thread, rent. She stopped. Martha leaned over her shoulder. Well? Elsie ran the figures again. The answer did not improve. Buying the remaining cloth locally would cost more than Grant Hale was paying for the completed order. Elsie turned to the stack beside the wall. There was enough wool for 23 coats, nothing beyond that. She looked at the calendar nailed beside the stove. 19 days remained. For the first time since she had written 80 coats across the top of her notebook, Elsie could see exactly where the contract might end. Grant Hale arrived before breakfast the next morning. Elsie was already in the workroom. 3 women sat at the machines. Martha stood at the cutting board. Lottie was sorting buttons into small tin cups before school. Grant looked at the bare shelf where the next bolts of wool should have been. You are short. Elsie kept marking a sleeve. By enough to matter. How much? Enough that Reed's price would erase the contract. Grant removed his gloves. I can have wool brought in. Elsie stopped marking. From where? My purchasing agent in Cheyenne. At your price? Yes, no. Grant looked at her. Elsie set down the chalk. The materials are my responsibility. You cannot sew coats without cloth, I noticed. I am offering a solution. You are offering to make my bad numbers disappear. Grant's thumb found the brass button at his coat. This is business, Elsie then treat it that way. It was the first time she had used his first name. Both of them noticed. Neither mentioned it. Grant looked toward the women at the machines. What do you suggest? I do not know yet. That is not comforting. It is accurate. Martha hid a smile behind a length of lining. Grant finally nodded. Fine. He put his gloves back on. If you need something from Hale Cross, ask, Elsie returned to the sleeve. "I will." Grant left. Lottie waited until the door shut. He looked mad. He looked inconvenienced. Is that different? Usually, the answer came that afternoon. Elsie had walked to the freight yard to ask what it would cost to bring cloth from the railhead. 2 Hale Cross wagons were standing near the loading platform. They had carried hides and boxed tallow south that morning. Now men were tying down nothing more than empty canvas covers for the return trip. Elsie stopped. She watched the teamster climb onto the seat. How often do those wagons come back empty? The man looked down at her. Most trips. Why? Not much going north that Mr. Hale needs. Elsie stared at the empty wagon bed. Then she turned and walked straight toward the telegraph office. By evening, she had 3 numbers written in her notebook. Mill price. Freight from the Eastern Textile Mill to the regional railhead. Return wagon space from the railhead to Sage Hollow. The total was lower than Reed's wholesale price had ever been. Grant read the figures the next morning at Hale Cross. "You want to rent space on my returning wagons. Yes, I could give you the space. I am not asking for it." He leaned back in his chair. "What rate did the freight yard quote?" Elsie told him. "That is too high. It is the standard rate. My wagons are already making the trip. Then you still have the right to charge for the space." Grant studied her. "You would rather pay me than owe me." "Yes, that sounds expensive. It is cheaper than confusion." For a moment, he said nothing. Then he wrote the rate into her agreement. Standard freight. No discount. Elsie looked at the number. "Good." Grant slid the paper back. "You are a difficult woman to help. I am becoming easier to hire." That earned a real smile. She sent the mill order that afternoon. Nearly every dollar of the material advance went with it. For 3 days, the workroom continued on the wool they had. 20 coats became 30. 30 became 37. Then the shelf went empty. The machine stopped. The silence was worse than noise. Elsie used the day to recut patterns and prepare linings. Martha tested seams. The other women trimmed thread and sorted buttons. At noon, Calvin Reed appeared in the doorway. He did not step inside. Martha looked up. Reed held a folded paper. "I can guarantee you work through March." Elsie said nothing. Reed continued. "Regular wages. No missed days because someone cannot find her materials." One of the younger seamstresses looked toward Elsie. Reed noticed. "The offer is open to 2 more. Martha took the paper. She read it. Then she folded it once. "You picked a useful morning. I picked an honest one." Reed left. By sunset, 1 woman had accepted his offer. She apologized to Elsie before going. Elsie did not blame her. A promise of wages was worth more than loyalty when coal had to be bought and children fed. Martha remained, but the folded offer stayed beside her machine. Elsie saw it. The next morning, wagon bells sounded outside. Lottie reached the window first. The wool. Elsie was out the door before the girl finished speaking. 2 Hale Cross wagons rolled into the yard. Heavy wrapped bolts filled the beds. The driver handed Elsie a mill invoice and freight receipt. Both carried her name. She checked every figure. Then, she carried the papers inside. Martha was standing beside her machine. Elsie placed the invoice on the cutting board. "Here is the mill price." Beside it, she placed Grant's freight charge. "Here is transport." Then she opened her notebook to the labor page. "And here is what each completed coat pays." The women gathered around. Elsie pointed to the totals. "If we finish on schedule, everyone gets what I promised." Martha read the figures. "What if we do not?" "Then I lose before any of you do." Martha looked at her. Then she picked up Calvin Reed's offer. She tore it cleanly in half. "Start cutting." The room came alive. Fresh wool rolled across the boards. Shears opened and closed. Treadles began their steady rhythm. For the first time, Elsie could see a path to 80. Then the weather changed. The temperature fell hard overnight. Water froze in buckets inside the ranch barns. By morning, Grant rode into town with frost on his coat collar. The upper trail is closing sooner than expected. Elsie looked up from the cutting board. How much sooner? 2 days. The room went still. Grant continued. My high country crews leave in 36 hours. Elsie looked around. There were unfinished sleeves hanging from chairbacks. Stacks of cut lining covered the table. Finished coats filled every available hook. How many complete? Grant asked. Martha answered. 47. Elsie did not speak for several seconds. Then she looked at Grant. I need more room. The shearing barn is empty. I saw it. You can use it. I will rent it. Grant almost argued. Then stopped. What rate? Elsie named one. He nodded. Within an hour, tables, machines, wool, thread, and lamps were being loaded onto wagons. By dusk, the empty shearing barn at Hale Cross had become a work floor. Rows of finished coats hung from the rafters. 33 remained incomplete. Martha stood beside Elsie beneath the long wooden beams. Grant checked his watch. 36 hours. Elsie took up the blue chalk. Then, nobody wastes the first one. By midnight, Elsie stopped sewing. Not because the work was finished. Because she had finally understood why it was not. Too many people were doing whole coats from beginning to end. She stood in the center of the shearing barn and looked at the tables, machines, piles of sleeves, cut linings, loose buttons, and women moving constantly without gaining enough ground. Martha. Martha looked up from a cuff. Yes, you are taking finishing. All of it? All of it. Elsie pointed across the barn. Sarah and May stay on sleeves. Clara does linings. I will cut and mark. Nobody carries a coat from start to finish anymore. Martha set down her needle. And inspection? Yours. That made Martha pause. Until then, Elsie had checked every finished garment herself. Martha walked to the nearest completed coat. She gripped the shoulder seam with both hands and pulled. It held. Then stop standing there, she said. We have work. Elsie almost smiled. The barn changed within 20 minutes. Cut pieces moved from table to table. Sleeves became coats faster. Buttons stopped piling up in cups. Martha rejected crooked stitching before it traveled farther down the line. Grant came through the side door carrying a box of lamp oil. Elsie pointed toward an empty bench. Put that there. He did. No advice. No questions. That mattered more than he knew. Outside, the temperature kept falling. Inside, the barn smelled of wool, hot metal, lamp smoke, and the faint old trace of sheep that no amount of sweeping had removed. Grant's ranch hands kept clear of the work floor. When they needed something from the building, they entered through the far door and stayed against the wall. Near 2 a.m, Grant found Elsie at the cutting table. She was rubbing blue chalk from her fingertips. You have 21 left, he said. 19 after these 2. You could delay the crew until afternoon. No, the trail will still be open. That is not the agreement. Grant rolled the brass button beneath his thumb. It would not ruin me. Elsie looked at him. That is not the point. He waited. She nodded toward the women still working. They agreed to finish because I told them the deadline was real. If I change it because I know a wealthy man who can move the clock, then Calvin Reed was right about me. Grant stopped touching the button. What was he right about? That this only works if you carry me. Grant looked across the barn. Martha was inspecting a seam beneath the lamplight. Lottie had gone home hours earlier with a neighbor. Nobody in the room was working for free. Nobody had been ordered there by Grant Hale. He looked back at Elsie. I will have the wagons ready at the agreed time. Thank you. He left her to work. Just before dawn, Martha called Elsie's name. Not loudly. That was enough. Elsie crossed the barn. 6 coats lay across one table. Martha had opened the cuffs. Feel this. Elsie ran 2 fingers over the inner lining. It was thinner than the rest. A different roll. Elsie remembered it immediately. One of the first lining bundles delivered from the mill had seemed softer. They had used it because the invoice listed the same grade. Martha pulled the cloth against the edge of the cuff. It stretched too easily. These will wear through. Elsie looked toward the barn doors. Beyond them, the sky had begun turning gray. How long? To reopen, replace, close, and inspect? Yes, with everybody? Martha glanced at the clock. An hour. Maybe more. The crew was due to load in less than 90 minutes. Elsie stared at the 6 coats. They were finished. They looked correct. Grant might never notice. A rider would. Maybe not today. Maybe 3 weeks from now, when the weak lining tore and cold worked inside his sleeve. Elsie picked up her shears. Opened them. Nobody complained. 6 finished cuffs came apart. Fresh lining was cut. Needles moved again. When Grant entered at sunrise, he found only 74 coats hanging from the rafters. His eyes moved to the table. What happened? Bad lining. Can it be worn? Yes, can it last? Elsie looked at him. No, Grant nodded once. Then fix it. He walked outside. That was all. The loading yard was already awake. Men tightened straps across supply wagons. Horses shifted in the cold. Breath drifted white from men and animals. Calvin Reed arrived in a closed buggy just as the first ranch hands began collecting their gear. He stepped down wearing a dark wool overcoat. Grant saw him but said nothing. Reed looked toward the barn. Short order? Grant checked his watch. Not yet. Reed straightened one glove. I brought 20 store coats. I thought you might prefer not to send men into the high country without proper clothing. Grant looked at the bundled coats in Reed's buggy. Generous, practical. The barn doors opened. Martha emerged carrying 2 coats. Behind her came Clara with 2 more. Elsie followed with the last pair across both arms. 6 coats. Grant looked at his watch again. 3 minutes remained. Elsie walked to the loading rail. 80. Martha handed Grant the final coat. He checked the shoulder. Then the cuff. Then he reached both arms forward. The gusset opened smoothly behind him. He handed the coat to Tom Becker. Try it. Tom put it on. He lifted his arms. Twisted, reached across an imaginary gate. Still better than the first one she murdered. Several men laughed. Elsie pointed toward him. I can alter yours back. Tom immediately stepped away. No need. Calvin Reed stood beside his buggy. His 20 coats remained tied inside. Grant turned to him. Future clothing orders will be bid. Reed's face tightened. We have done business for 6 years, and we may again. You are replacing an established supplier with a widow sewing in a barn? Grant looked toward Elsie. She delivered 80 coats at the agreed price, to the agreed standard, by the agreed time. Elsie stepped forward. And I am not asking you to stop buying from Mr. Reed. Grant looked at her. She continued, I only need the chance to compete. Grant nodded. That is what you will have. Reed looked from one to the other. Then he returned to his buggy. No one stopped him. By afternoon, the high country crew was gone. Elsie paid every worker before she paid herself. Martha counted her wages twice. Then she pushed the coins into her purse. You need a supervisor. Elsie closed the account book. I was thinking the same thing. What does it pay? Elsie named a figure. Martha raised one eyebrow. Make it 5% higher. 3, 4. Elsie held out her hand. 4. Martha shook it. In March, Elsie leased the second room beside her old workspace. Then the first. A sign went above the door. Rowan Work Clothing, A&D Alterations. Her mill account remained under her own name. Grant never asked to be added to it. Lottie received one new Sunday dress that spring. Blue wool. Simple collar. strong him. When she first wore it, she stood before the mirror and turned once. Then she ran outside before Elsie could warn her about mud. Grant began visiting the shop without pretending every visit concerned coats. Sometimes he brought measurements. Sometimes he brought coffee. Once he brought nothing. Elsie noticed. She did not send him away. On a warm April morning, a new cutting table arrived. Grant stood at one end while Elsie stood at the other. "Hold this tight," she said. He took the chalked measuring cord. Lottie sat nearby with the account book open before her. "First order for the new room," she announced. Elsie lifted the cord. Grant held steady. She snapped it down. A straight blue line appeared across the clean wood. If you enjoyed watching Elsie build something she could truly call her own, subscribe and leave a like for more Wild West stories.